What would you do if the family you had married into laughed in your face, handed you the key to a crumbling gatehouse on the edge of a forgotten estate, and told you it was all you would ever have of your husband's name? That is what happened to Sarah Ward, 23 years old, 6 months a widow, when her in-laws divided the Barrow Gate estate among themselves and left her the one building nobody wanted. They thought they had buried her. They thought they had made an ending of her. But hidden behind the soot-blackened stones of that gatehouse chimney was a paper that would undo every laugh they had loosed against her name. Stay with the story. Settle in. Let us know where you're listening from tonight. Because what Sarah found in that ruin is worth the whole slow telling. The coach set her down at the crossroads a little after 4, in a gray rain that fell without hurry. Sarah stood in the wet with her single trunk beside her and watched the driver flick the reins and roll on toward the market town, as though he did not wish to be seen leaving a woman in such a place. The lane before her ran between 2 hedgerows so overgrown they had almost closed above it. Beyond them, half a mile off, the chimneys of Barrow Gate stood black against the low cloud. She had not been to the estate since the summer she was married. Then it had been thin gold light on cut lawns, a long table set under the elms, her husband's hand resting warm at the small of her back. Now the elms were bare, and her husband was 6 months in the ground of a parish churchyard 40 miles away, and the hand at the small of her back was only the cold of a wet wool cloak. Sarah bent, took the trunk by its leather handles, and started walking. The lane was muddy under her boots, one of which had been mended twice at the toe. She had been told at the solicitor's office in town what she was to receive. She had been told again, more sharply, by her husband's eldest brother, in a letter that had reached her only 2 days ago, in case she had entertained any misunderstandings. The old gatehouse. Nothing more. No portion of the estate, no share of the rents, no seat at the family board. The gatehouse and what furniture it happened to contain, which was, she gathered, very little. She walked with her head down against the rain, and her mind emptied out by the walking. Grief had taught her that. Grief was a country you could only cross by putting one foot before the other and refusing to count the miles. At last the hedgerows opened, and the great iron gates of Barrow Gate rose before her, rusted at the hinges, hanging open as though nobody had thought them worth closing. And there, to the left of the gates, set close against the ivy-choked wall, stood the gatehouse. It was smaller than she remembered, and worse. Half the slates on the little roof had slid or fallen, showing the black ribs of the timbers beneath. The whitewash had gone from the walls in long patches. One window was broken and stuffed with a rag. The door hung on a single hinge. The chimney, wide and squat, was streaked with green where the rain had run for years unchecked. Sarah set her trunk down on the flagstones before the door and stood a long moment, only looking. She did not weep. She had wept out most of what she had to weep at the churchyard in the summer, and what remained she kept for private hours. She only looked at the gatehouse the way a farmer looks at a field that has flooded, measuring what could still be saved. Then she heard the laughter. It came from up the drive, from the wide steps of the great house itself, where 3 figures had come out to watch her arrival. Her husband's eldest brother, Mr. Rowland Ward, tall in his frock coat, his stick planted like a magistrate's, his wife beside him, gloved hand at her mouth. And behind them, the youngest brother, Percival, whose laugh carried the furthest through the wet air. "She has actually come," Rowland called down the drive. His voice was not raised in welcome. It was raised in performance, for the benefit of any groom or gardener within earshot. "I had wagered she would not," "She has nowhere else, my dear," his wife said, and her voice, too, was pitched to travel. Percival came a few steps down the gravel, his hands in his pockets, his face bright with the cruel pleasure of a young man who has never yet been made small. "Welcome to your inheritance, sister," he called. "Mind the roof. I am told it leaks in 3 rooms, though there are only 2. Roland laughed. His wife laughed. A dog somewhere at the back of the house set up a distant barking, and then even that fell away. Sarah did not answer. She turned her face toward the gatehouse door, took her key from the pocket sewn inside her cloak, and set it to the lock. The key turned with a groan. The door yielded inward on its one hinge with a slow, exhausted sound, as though it had been waiting a long while to be pushed. Inside was cold, and the smell of damp plaster, and a single room with a stone floor, a broken chair, a rusted grate, and a bed frame in the corner without a mattress. A second, smaller room opened behind it, empty but for a scrubbed pine table on 3 legs. Above the grate rose the wide, blackened breast of the chimney, its stones streaked with old soot, its mantle a single beam of oak so darkened by fire and years that it looked almost like iron. Sarah stood in the middle of the room, with the rain sounding softly on what remained of the roof and the men's laughter still faint behind her on the drive, and she set her hand flat against the cold stone of the chimney breast, the way a person might steady herself against the shoulder of an animal. "Well," she said quietly, to no one, "we shall see." Behind her, the door creaked as the wind pushed it. Percival's voice carried once more from the drive, further off now, half swallowed by the rain. "A month," he called. "I give her a month." Roland's answer came fainter still, but she heard it clearly enough. "A fortnight." Then footsteps on gravel, and then only the rain, and only the gatehouse, and only Sarah standing in the middle of it, with her hand on the chimney, and her wet hem clinging to her ankles. She would have taken almost any other gift, a pension, a room in the servants' wing, a single acre with a hut on it, so long as she might have called it her own without laughter. Instead, they had given her this: a ruin at the edge of a ruin, a joke told in stone. She could have turned back. The coach would return to the crossroads at dawn. She had enough left in her purse for the fare home, if she chose to call anywhere home. Would you have stayed? Would you have set down your trunk in that cold room and unpacked, knowing the whole village would soon be laughing with the Wards? Or would you have gone before the sun rose? If this story moves you, take a moment to like, to leave a word below, and to subscribe so the next chapter finds you. Because Sarah did stay, and the chimney at her back was not the ruin they thought it was. The first night in the gatehouse passed slowly, and by gray degrees. Sarah slept in her cloak on the bare bed frame with her folded shawl beneath her head, and the rain that came through the missing slates dripped in 3 separate places into 3 tin dishes she had found rinsed and stacked on the sill. She had counted them before she lay down. She counted them again when she woke. The count was the same, and somehow this small constancy steadied her. At first light she pinned up her hair, laced her boots, and walked the half-mile of muddy lane back to the crossroads and on into the village of Barrow Gate. She needed bread. She needed a candle. She needed to know the shape of the place that would soon be laughing at her, and it seemed better to walk into that laughter with her chin up than to wait for it to come to her door. The village lay along one long street between low stone houses and a squat gray church with a leaning yew in its yard. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. A cart stood outside the smithy. 2 women at a doorway broke off their talk when they saw her and made no pretense of resuming it. A boy in a smock stopped in the road and stared until his mother caught his sleeve. Sarah walked on. At the baker's, the woman behind the counter set down her cloth and looked at Sarah's mended cuffs and wet hem before she looked at her face. "You'll be the widow then," she said. "I shall," Sarah said. "Living up at the gate. I shall." The baker cut a small loaf, took Sarah's coin, and did not quite meet her eye. As Sarah turned for the door, the baker said, low, "Mind the roof." The door closed on the sound of laughter from the back room. Outside, the village had begun to move about its mourning, and the whispers moved with it. She heard the word gatehouse behind her twice before she reached the churchyard wall. She heard the name Ward. She heard, without quite hearing, the phrase "a fortnight passed, hand to hand, like a coin." Then she heard boots on cobbles, and Percival was crossing the square toward her with his hat pushed back and his color high from riding. He stopped square in her path so that she must either speak to him or go around him in front of half the street. "Still here, sister," he said. "Still here." And the roof? Where it was. He smiled and turned to the small audience gathering by the pump. "She keeps her humor, at least. That is more than the house will keep by Christmas." A laugh rose. He tipped his hat to her with a slow, mock courtesy. "If you want a bed at the house, sister, you have only to say so. Roland will find you one. In the scullery." He walked on, and the laughter walked on with him. Sarah stood a moment with the loaf pressed against her side and her face carefully quiet. Then she went on toward the churchyard, because she did not trust herself to turn back down the street just yet. It was at the lych gate that the old woman spoke to her. Sarah had not seen her at first. She sat on the stone bench inside the gate with a black shawl drawn close and a stick between her knees, thin as a bundle of sticks herself, her eyes pale and steady in a face folded fine as linen. A former tenant, Sarah would learn later, a woman who had lived once in a cottage on the estate and been turned out of it when the old squire died. For now she was only an old woman on a bench, and she lifted her stick a little to catch Sarah's step. "You are the young Mrs. Ward." "I am." The old woman looked at her a long moment, at the mended boots and the wet hem and the loaf, and her eyes did not pity and did not mock. "The chimney knows what the house forgot," she said. "Listen to the chimney, child." Sarah opened her mouth and closed it again. The old woman had already turned her face back toward the church door, as though the sentence had cost her the last of her breath. There was nothing to say to it. Sarah bowed her head to her, because that seemed the only right thing, and went out through the lych gate into the lane. By the time she reached the crossroads, the rain had begun again, thin and slanting. She walked the muddy half-mile back to the gatehouse with the loaf inside her cloak, and the old woman's line turning over in her mind like a coin she could not yet spend. The gatehouse was as she had left it. The 3 tin dishes stood on the sill. The door hung on its single hinge. The chimney breast rose black and squat at the end of the room, and Sarah, coming in out of the wet, found herself looking at it before she looked at anything else. She set the loaf on the 3-legged pine table and propped the table's 4th corner on a stack of 2 broken slates. She hung her cloak on a nail. She knelt at the grate and cleared the wet ash from it with her hands, and when her hands were black, she wiped them on a rag and began again. There was coal in a scuttle by the wall, damp but usable. There was a tinderbox on the mantel that someone long ago had left behind. The first 3 strikes gave nothing. The 4th caught. She fed the small flame with splinters pulled from the broken chair, then with a lump of coal, then with another, and at last a low red heart began to beat in the grate. And warmth, faint and grudging, crept out into the room. Sarah sat on the flagstones with her back against the cold stone of the chimney breast and ate a piece of the bread slowly, tearing it with her fingers. Outside, the light thickened toward dusk. The rain steadied on the roof. A rook called once from the ivy on the wall, and then the estate beyond the gates was silent. She listened. She had never lived alone before. In her father's house there had been sisters and a clock. In her husband's cottage there had been his step on the boards and his cough in the night. Here there was only the rain and the fire and the small tin sound of water in the dishes, and beneath all of these, if she held very still, another sound she could not at first place. A slow, dry breathing. A draw. A pull. The chimney above her was drinking the air of the room and carrying it up, and the note of that drawing, low and steady as a sleeping animal, seemed to come not only from the flue, but from the stones themselves. She turned her head against the chimney breast and set her ear to the soot-dark stone. It was warm now, faintly, from the fire below, and through the warmth she felt, or thought she felt, a hollow. Not the hollow of the flue itself which she could see. Another hollow, set back and to one side, muffled by stone. A place where the wall answered her ear differently from the places around it. She sat back and looked at the chimney breast a long time. Then she banked the fire, drew her cloak over herself, and lay down on the bed frame with the rain on the broken slates and the old woman's line still turning in her mind. Listen to the chimney, child. She did not yet know what she had heard, but she had heard something, and in the last moment before sleep took her, she thought, quite clearly and without knowing why, a fortnight would not be enough. Not for what this house meant to tell her. Sarah woke before the light. The fire had gone to a red eye in the grate, and the rain had thinned to a slow tapping on the slates that were left. She lay a moment on the bed frame, listening for the sound she had heard the night before, and could not hear it now that the flue was cold. That was its own kind of proof. A living house had voices only when it was moving, and the chimney had been moving when the fire drew. She rose, folded her cloak, and set water on the grate in the tin dish she had rinsed the night before. While it warmed, she stood in front of the chimney breast and looked at it as if she had never looked at it before. The stones were laid rough and wide, in the old way, mortared with lime gone gray and pitted, 10 courses from the flagstones to the mantel, uneven, the way country masons built when they built for warmth and not for show. Soot had blackened them almost to a single color, but not quite. The morning light, thin as it was, came sideways through the little front window and picked out the faces of the stones one from another, and Sarah saw, for the first time, that they were not all of a piece. Most of the stones were the pale gray limestone she had seen in the walls of the church and the low houses along the village street. But 3, set close together at about the height of her shoulder and a little to the right of the flue, were a darker stone. Ironstone, perhaps, or something quarried elsewhere. She had not noticed the difference by candlelight or firelight. In the sideways morning it was plain. She stepped closer. She ran her fingertips along the mortar between the 3 darker stones. It was smoother than the mortar between their neighbors. Not much smoother, just enough that a hand which had spent an hour cleaning ash would feel the change. The lime in this seam had been worked with a different tool, or by a different hand, or in a different year. She stood back. She did not press it. She did not fetch a knife or a poker or begin to pick. The old woman's line came again, unbidden. Listen to the chimney, child. Listen was the word. Not open, not break, not yet. Sarah made her tea from the last of the leaves twisted in a scrap of paper in her trunk, and she ate the heel of yesterday's loaf, and she watched the 3 dark stones from where she sat on the flagstones with her back against the cold wall opposite. The seam between them held her eye the way a word misspelt on a printed page holds the eye. It was not wrong exactly. It was only different. And in a chimney that had stood 200 winters, different was a thing worth marking. A movement at the doorway made her turn. A cat had come to the threshold, thin and gray and dust-streaked, one ear notched, its yellow eyes narrowed against the light off the flagstones. It sat down on the sill and considered her without hurry, the way cats do when a room has newly changed owners, and they intend to see whether the change suits them. "Well," Sarah said quietly, "come in then." The cat did not come in, nor did it leave. It sat and watched her a long moment, and then rose and stepped, deliberate as a magistrate, across the flagstones and past her knee and to the base of the chimney breast, where it sat again and lifted its head and stared, unblinking, at the 3 dark stones. Sarah watched the cat watch the wall. She said nothing. After a while, the cat lowered its chin onto its paws and closed its eyes and slept where it sat, warmed by the last heat rising from the banked grate, as if it had done so every morning of its life. She did not know whose cat it had been. She did not ask. Some creatures adopt a house before they adopt a person, and this one had plainly done both. She left the 3 dark stones alone that day, but she did not stop seeing them. Wherever she stood in the room, from whichever angle she turned, her eye returned to them the way a tongue returns to a chipped tooth. She thought of what the old woman had said. She thought of the hollow her ear had believed it heard through the warm stone. She thought of a fortnight, and of Roland's stick, and of Percival's laughing color in the market square. And she resolved, without speaking the resolve aloud, that before she touched the chimney at all, she would first learn the whole of the house. That resolve became the shape of the following days. She began at the door, because the door was the first insult and would be the first mended thing. She lifted it from its single hinge, laid it flat across 2 stones in the yard, and worked the second hinge free of the frame with a bent iron nail she found under the grate. The wood of the door was oak and sound beneath its weathered face. She scrubbed it with sand and rainwater until the grain came up. The cat watched from the sill. When the door was clean, she leaned it against the wall to dry and turned to the roof. She could not mend slate she did not have, but she could shift what was left. She climbed by way of the ivy and the low garden wall onto the small flat step at the eaves, and she pushed the fallen slates that still lay in the gutter up over the holes she could reach, weighting them with stones from the ruined pigsty behind the gatehouse. It was rough work, and it would not last a winter. It would last a fortnight. It would last 2. She came down with her palms scraped and her skirt wet and her hair loosed at the nape, and she set the 3 tin dishes back on the sill in the same order she had found them. Inside, she took the room in hand. She swept the flagstones with a besom she made from a bundle of hedge twigs and a length of twine cut from her trunk strap. She lifted the broken chair into the yard for its wood. She scrubbed the pine table on its 3 good legs and steadied the 4th on a fresh stack of slate. She washed the little window with rag and rainwater until the leaded panes let in a milky, honest light. She wiped the mantel beam of its soot and found, beneath the black oak of a color like dark honey, and one deep gouge along its underside that no fire had made. Every day, when she paused to rest, she drank cold water from a tin cup and sat with her back to the wall opposite the chimney. And she looked. And every day the 3 dark stones looked back. The cat took to sleeping on the mantel. It fitted itself along the oak beam as if it had been made for that ledge, and its gray flank rose and fell with a slow patience that seemed to Sarah, in the long silences of her scrubbing, to keep time with something older than either of them. She did not name it. To name it would have been to claim it, and she was not yet sure whether the cat was hers or the house's or the estate's. On the 3rd morning she found a small square of iron in the ash beneath the grate. She thought it a nail at first, and then a coin, and then, wiping it on her apron, saw that it was a mason's tag no larger than her thumbnail, stamped through with a mark she did not know. A crescent above 3 straight cuts. She turned it in the pale window light. She set it on the mantel beside the sleeping cat. 2 mornings later, clearing ash again, she found another. Same iron, same crescent, same 3 cuts. She set that one on the mantel too. By the end of the 1st week, she had 4 such tags, all pulled from the ash under the grate, all stamped alike. And she had swept from the corners of the room a small collection of other quiet oddities. A shard of black wax with the print of a signet still clear in it. A scrap of paper burned to the edge of a written line so that only the words in trust for remained. And, from the crack between the flagstone and the base of the chimney breast, a single dry sprig of rosemary bound with a length of red thread. She did not yet understand any of it. Her hands understood it before her mind did. Her hands had begun to know the chimney the way a rider knows a horse, where it was warm, where it was cold, where the mortar gave slightly under a thumb, and where it did not give at all. She would stop mid-sweep and press her palm flat to a stone and stand a long moment, listening not with her ear now, but with the whole of her arm, and then return to her work without a word. On the 7th evening, sitting on the flagstones with the fire lit, and the cat on the mantel, and the 4 iron tags in a row beside it, Sarah drew the burnt scrap of paper from her apron pocket and read the 3 words again by firelight. In trust for. In trust for whom, and by whom, and against what, the paper did not say. But paper does not use those words lightly. Paper uses those words when land is meant, or a name, or a life. She folded the scrap back into her apron. She looked up at the 3 dark stones. The cat opened one yellow eye and closed it again. Soon, Sarah said, to no one. But not tonight. Outside the gatehouse, the rain had stopped. Somewhere along the lane, a horse passed at a walk, and did not stop, and went on toward the great house. Sarah listened until the hoofbeats were gone, and then she banked the fire and lay down, and slept without dreaming, as those who have worked well with their hands sleep. The 8th morning came in thin sunlight, the first clean light Sarah had seen in Barrow Gate. It fell through the little leaded window in narrow yellow bars and lay across the flagstones and up the lower courses of the chimney breast. Sarah stood in the middle of the room and looked at the 3 dark stones, and the 3 dark stones looked plainer in daylight than they had looked by fire. The mortar around them was smoother, as she had noted. It was also, she saw now in the low sun, a slightly different color, a shade paler than the mortar between the pale limestone above and below. A man who did this had matched his mortar as well as he could, and had not quite matched it. A man in a hurry. A man alone. She gathered her tools without hurry. She had the bent iron nail with which she had freed the door hinge. She had a flat stone she had picked from the pigsty wall the day before, thin enough to slide and hard enough not to crumble. She had a tin dish for whatever might come out of the wall, and a candle in a tin sconce because the fire would need to be let go cold. She put the fire out with a dipper of rainwater and waited for the stones to lose their heat. The cat watched from the mantel and did not move. At noon, Sarah set the candle on the flagstones and knelt at the chimney breast. She began with the middle of the 3 dark stones. She worked the tip of the iron nail into the pale mortar seam at its lower edge and drew it along, and the mortar came away in a dry gray powder that fell onto the tin dish. She was slow. She was very slow. She had not come this far in silence to be hurried at the end. When the seam was clean along the bottom, she started at the sides, and then along the top, and by the time the light through the window had climbed to the mantel, she had traced the middle stone free of its bedding on all 4 sides. She set the nail down. She wiped her hands on her apron. She fitted the flat stone against the lower edge of the dark stone and pressed. Nothing moved. She pressed harder, with her shoulder behind her hand, and the stone shifted a hair, and then another hair, and then it slid outward toward her a full inch, and then 2, gritting on the sill of stone beneath it. Sarah eased it out with both hands and laid it on the flagstones. It was heavier than it looked, and warm where her palms had been. Behind the stone was darkness. She lifted the candle. She saw first the sooted back of a small square recess cut into the thickness of the chimney breast, no deeper than her forearm and no wider than her 2 spread hands. She saw next a folded thing set upright at the back of the recess and wrapped in oilskin, gone stiff and brown with time. She saw next, at its foot, a smaller thing bound in linen and tied with a fine cord. She did not put in her hand at once. She sat back on her heels and looked, because a thing that has waited a long time is owed the courtesy of being looked at before it is disturbed. Then she reached in. The oilskin package was the size of a folded letter and heavy for its size. The linen bundle was the weight of a small stone. She drew both out and set them on the pine table beside the candle. The cat lifted its head from the mantel and watched. Sarah untied the linen first, because it was smaller and she was not yet ready for the other. Inside the linen lay a signet in tarnished silver, its face cut with a crescent above 3 straight strokes, the same mark stamped on the iron mason's tags in a row along the mantel. She set it beside them, and it belonged there. Then she untied the oilskin. The folds were stiff and cracked at the creases. A fine brown dust came off them onto her hands. Within the oilskin lay a single sheet of heavy paper folded in thirds, and within its first fold a second smaller paper, and pressed between them a strip of red ribbon dark with age. Sarah unfolded the larger paper on the pine table with her fingertips, gently, as one lifts the wing of a moth. It was a deed. The hand was formal and old, brown ink faded at the loops, but every word held. She read it once through without breathing and once again more slowly. It conveyed, in trust for the wife of the youngest son of the House of Ward, in perpetuity, and against all later dispositions of the estate, the North Field, the Mill Meadow, the copse called Long Hollow, and the cottages standing thereon, being in sum a full third of the arable land of Barrow Gate, together with the rents and issues thereof. It was signed by the old squire in a shaking hand, and witnessed by the parish vicar of that year, and sealed with black wax bearing the same crescent and 3 strokes. The date was more than 20 years old. The smaller paper inside was a note in a different hand, the hand plainer, the ink less faded. It said only, in 8 words, "I have hid this where the smoke goes." Beneath, in the same hand, a mark like a rough cross made of 3 straight cuts. Sarah sat on the flagstones with the deed spread on her knees and the candle guttering on the pine table above her, and did not move for a long time. Her husband had been the youngest son of the youngest son. His grandfather had been the old squire, his grandmother the wife of the youngest son of that generation, had been dead before Sarah was born. And yet the paper said in perpetuity and against all later dispositions, and the paper was witnessed, and the paper was sealed. It had lain in the chimney 20 years and more, and no fire had touched it, because the man who hid it had chosen his place well. She folded the deed back into its oilskin. She wrapped the signet in its linen. She put both, and the smaller note, into the deep inner pocket sewn into the lining of her cloak, the same pocket that had carried her key on the day she came. She fitted the dark stone back into its bed and pressed a paste of ash and water into the seams so the wall looked as it had. She swept the gray powder from the flagstones into the fire pit. She washed her hands in the tin dish. She sat down at the pine table and rested her forehead on her folded arms. And for the first time in 7 months, she wept, quietly, without sound, the way a woman weeps when a long weight lifts, and she is not yet sure her back will straighten. When she raised her head, the light in the window had gone the color of pale honey, and the cat was standing on the mantel with its yellow eyes fixed on her, and she said, aloud, to the cat and to the room, "So that is what he meant." She did not say who he was. She did not need to. The old woman at the lich gate had told her plainly enough, and only now did she hear it. That night she did not light the fire. She sat on the flagstones with her back against the cold chimney breast, and the cloak wrapped over her knees, and the deed against her ribs inside its oilskin, and she listened to the estate settle into darkness beyond the broken gates. She slept at last, sitting up, with one hand pressed against the pocket at her heart. The weather turned in the night. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of the door straining on its 2 mended hinges, and a low continuous drumming above her that she knew at once was not rain, but hail. Wind was coming down off the fells in long, shuddering waves. The ivy on the outside wall thrashed against the stones like a beaten sheet. The 3 tin dishes on the sill had begun to sing a thin, chattering note. She rose stiff from the flagstones, drew her cloak tight, and went to the window. The lane was white with hail, and beyond it the low field was flattened silver, and above the great house the sky was the color of wet slate boiling. She had seen storms in her father's country, and she knew this one would sit down over Barrow Gate for hours, perhaps a day. She turned back to the room and set about it. She built the fire small and hot with the last of the dry splinters. She pushed the pine table against the door as a brace. She moved the tin dishes to fresh spots where new drips were already starting through the hail-loosened patches of her roof. She took the deed from her cloak and laid it in its oilskin inside an iron pot on the mantel with the lid weighted by a stone, because water is a patient thief, and she would not have it in. The storm came fully down at mid-morning. Slates lifted somewhere at the ridge and clattered off into the yard. The ivy tore free in a long green rope and struck the window and did not break it. Sarah crouched by the grate and fed the fire with what she had and waited, because there was nothing else to do, and the gatehouse had stood 200 winters and would likely stand 1 more. She heard the knocking near noon and did not at first believe it was knocking. It came again, weaker, and then a voice under the wind that was hardly a voice at all. Sarah pulled the pine table aside and opened the door on its hinges against the weight of the wind. A woman stood on the flagstones with a shawl plastered to her head and a child of perhaps 4 in her arms, wrapped in a sodden blanket. Behind her, halfway down the lane, a cart lay on its side with a horse standing patient beside it in the hail. The woman's lips were blue. The child was silent, which frightened Sarah more than crying would have. "Please," the woman said. That was all. Sarah brought them in. She shut the door and braced it again with the table. She stripped the child of the wet blanket and wrapped it in her own dry cloak and set it on the flagstones as close to the fire as heat would allow without harm. She peeled the shawl from the woman's shoulders and pressed a folded length of her spare shift into the woman's hands and turned her back while the woman changed. She dipped hot water from the tin dish and put it to the child's lips a spoonful at a time from a scrap of clean linen dipped and squeezed. She built the fire higher, though it cost her the last of the coal, and she did not think about the cost. The woman was a carter's wife from a village beyond the fells, bound with her husband for the market town when the storm caught them at the crossroads and threw the cart into the ditch. The husband had gone on foot to the great house for help and had not come back. The child had been sick 2 days already, the woman said, and the wet had gone to her chest. Sarah listened and did not speak much. She had a small store of dried mint from her trunk, and she brewed it thin and gave the child sips. She wrapped hot stones from the grate in strips of her shift and set them along the child's sides. She held the woman's hand while the woman shook, and then held the child on her own knees when the woman finally slept, sitting up against the chimney breast, and by the time the light behind the storm had dimmed toward evening, the child's breath had steadied and her small face had lost its gray. The wind rose again after dark, and the fire burned low. There was no more coal. Sarah looked once at the broken bed frame in the corner, and then she stood and took it apart with her hands and the bent iron nail, and she fed the dry oak of it into the grate slat by slat, and the fire came up bright, and the woman and the child slept on. She sat between the fire and the chimney breast with the pocket of her cloak, now wrapping the child, empty of the deed, and the deed in the iron pot on the mantel above her. And she thought clearly, for the first time, about what she meant to do. She had a paper that would take 1/3 of Barrowgate out of Roland's hand and set it in her own. She had witnesses 2 decades in the grave. She had a signet and a note in a hidden man's hand, and a wall that had kept faith with the dead. She had, on her lap, a stranger's child breathing against her ribs. She could put the deed back in the wall and mortar it in, and take the coach from the crossroads at dawn and go home to her father's house and let the estate fall to whoever could hold it. Roland would never know. The paper would sleep another 20 years or forever. No one would laugh at her again because no one would remember her at all. She looked down at the child. The child's hand had closed on the edge of her cuff in sleep. "So no," Sarah said quietly, "to the fire. I shall carry it." The storm blew itself out toward morning. Somewhere past first light, a man's voice called at the door, hoarse and near breaking, and Sarah opened to a broad, soaked figure with lantern in hand and the great house's undergroom at his elbow. The carter, come back at last with help. He fell on his knees on the flagstones at the sight of his wife and child alive by the fire, and he thanked Sarah in words that ran together, and Sarah, who had scarcely slept, only said, "Take them warm. Go slowly." She wrapped the child again in her own cloak for the walk, and told the carter to send the cloak back when he could. And he swore he would. And he did. When they were gone, she shut the door and leaned against it, and let the quiet come. The tin dishes stood full on the sill. The fire was almost out. The bed frame was gone. The pine table stood askew where she had dragged it from the door. On the mantel, above the 4 iron tags and the silver signet in its linen, the iron pot sat with its stone still upon its lid, and inside the pot the deed lay dry. Sarah crossed to the mantel and lifted the pot down and took the deed from it and slid it back into the pocket of her spare shawl and pinned the pocket shut with the same bent iron nail she had used on every task since she came. She banked what was left of the fire. She washed her face in a tin dish of cold rainwater. She put on her boots, one mended twice at the toe, and she pinned up her hair. And she opened the door onto a lane blinding with sun on melted hail, and she started down it toward the village, because a paper such as she carried was owed to the parish vicar before it was owed to any other soul on earth. The village at mid-morning smelt of wet stone and wood smoke, and the sharp green of hedges beaten flat by hail. Sarah kept to the lane's dry ridge where the sun had begun to lift the ice, and she did not look at the doorways she passed, though the doorways looked at her. Two women at the pump left off their talk. A boy carrying kindling stopped in the road. Word of the carter's night had run before her, as such word runs in a village at first light, and the whispers that met her now had a different shape from the whispers that had met her a fortnight before. Not Gatehouse, not a fortnight, but the child and the fire and the widow, and she took them in. The vicarage stood behind the squat grey church at the end of a path of flagstones set with moss. The vicar answered his own door in shirt sleeves and a grey waistcoat, a spare, slow-moving man with ink on the side of his thumb and reading spectacles pushed up onto his forehead. He knew her name before she gave it. He took her into a small book-lined study where a coal fire burned low, and he sat her by the fire, and he sent his housekeeper for tea without being asked. Sarah unpinned the pocket of her spare shawl and drew out the oilskin and laid the deed on the table between them. The vicar unfolded it with the care of a man handling a christening record. He read it once through in silence. He read it again. He looked at the seal and at the shaking signature and at the witness line where a hand from 20 years earlier had written his predecessor's name in the same slow, careful copperplate the parish register kept still. Then he took the smaller paper and read the 8 words and the little cross of 3 straight cuts, and he was quiet for a long moment. "It is what it appears to be," he said at last. "In trust and in perpetuity. Properly signed, properly witnessed. The seal is the old squire's own." He looked at her across the table with a mild, steady, gently impressed gaze. "You know what this means." "I know," Sarah said. "There will need to be a solicitor," he said. "There will need to be a sitting at the county town. There will be some noise before there is quiet. But the paper stands. No later disposition undoes a trust of this kind, and no brother of your husband's has any claim against it. The land is yours to hold." He folded the deed again with his own hands and slid it back into the oilskin and returned it to her across the table, as though returning a child to its mother. "Keep it close until Thursday. I will write tonight." Sarah drank the tea the housekeeper brought. She did not weep in the vicar's study, though her hands shook once around the cup, and she set it down until they stilled. When she rose to go, the vicar rose with her and walked her to the door. And at the door he said, quiet and plain, "Your husband's grandmother was a kind woman. I am glad her paper found the right hand." Outside the village had gathered without gathering. The baker stood on her step with flour on her wrists. The smith had come out of the smithy in his leather apron. The 2 women at the pump were still there, and the boy with the kindling, and half a dozen others besides, and none of them spoke as Sarah came down the flagstones from the vicarage, and none of them laughed. The baker met her at the churchyard wall with a fresh loaf wrapped in a clean cloth and pressed it into her hands, and would take no coin for it. "For the child," the baker said, though the child was already gone home over the fells. Sarah understood the loaf was not for the child. She thanked the baker and walked on. At the lich gate, The old woman in the black shawl sat on the stone bench, as she had sat before, her stick between her knees, her pale, steady eyes lifted to Sarah's face. Sarah stopped. She did not speak of the chimney, and the old woman did not ask. The old woman only nodded once, very slowly, the way one nods to a thing long expected and at last arrived, and Sarah bowed her head to her and went on through the gate into the lane. Roland was waiting at the crossroads with Percival a pace behind him. Word had reached them too. Roland's stick was in his hand, but he was not leaning on it, and his color was not high, and his eyes, when they found Sarah's, were the eyes of a man who has been shown a paper in a vicar's hand by a messenger and has understood it before the messenger finished speaking. Percival stood with his hat off, turning it slowly by the brim. "Sister," Roland said. The word came out level, without the coach-step laughter of a fortnight before. "The vicar has written to me." "Yes," Sarah said. "The North Field," he said. "The mill meadow, Long Hollow, the cottages." He said the names the way a man says the names of children he has lost. "My grandfather's hand." "Yes." He was silent a moment. Then he said, "It is a just paper. I shall not stand against it." "I did not think you would," Sarah said, and she meant it, and he heard that she meant it, and something in his shoulders eased that had perhaps been rigid in him for longer than a fortnight. Percival behind him opened his mouth and closed it again, and put his hat back on his head at last. He did not speak. He did not need to. His face carried the whole of it. "There is a room at the house," Roland said, "if you should wish it while the papers are sat upon." "I have a house," Sarah said quietly. "I shall keep to it." He inclined his head. He did not laugh. He stepped aside from the lane, and Percival stepped aside with him, and Sarah walked between them and down the muddy half-mile toward the rusted iron gates of Barrowgate and the little squat gatehouse beside them, with the loaf in one hand and the deed pinned inside her shawl over her heart, and the sun climbing behind her on the melted hail. By the end of that season, the land was hers in law as it had been in trust. The county solicitor came out from town in a black coach and sat at the pine table on its 3 good legs and its stack of slate, and confirmed in calm, competent words what she and the vicar and the old squire's shaking hand had known already. Outsiders came after him, a land agent to walk the North Field, a mason to look at the cottages in Long Hollow, a miller's son to ask after the meadow. Sarah met them all at the gatehouse door. She did not move up to the great house. She did not put on new boots. The cottages in Long Hollow she gave, at fair rent, back to those who had been turned out of them when the old squire died, and the old woman in the black shawl came home to her own hearth on a cart driven by the carter, who would take no coin for the driving, and brought his wife and his mended child with him to help carry the old woman's few things across the threshold. The child ran once across the flagstones of the gatehouse yard to press her face against Sarah's apron, and then ran back to her mother, and the gray cat with the notched ear watched from the mantel and did not stir. Autumn came slow and gold over Barrowgate. Sarah had the roof of the gatehouse mended properly in slate, and the door hung new on 3 good hinges, and a bed built into the corner from oak that was not the broken frame, and a second room made warm and dry for the old woman's visits, and a small stove set beside the wide chimney breast, where the 3 dark stones had been mortared back so cleanly that no eye but hers would find the seam. The iron pot stayed on the mantel. The 4 iron tags and the silver signet in its linen stayed beside it. The deed itself, once sealed at the county town, lay folded in a locked tin box in a drawer of the pine table, which now stood on 4 sound legs of its own. On an evening near the end of October, with the light going honey along the top of the ivy on the estate wall and the rooks turning slow above the great house, Sarah stood at her own doorway with the cat winding round her ankles and the old woman on the bench beside the door and the carter's child asleep in the old woman's lap. The chimneys of Barrow Gate stood black against a sky the color of new copper. Smoke rose from her own roof, steady and straight. From up the lane came the small, ordinary sound of a horse walking home. The old woman said, without lifting her eyes, "You have your inheritance, then." Sarah looked at the roof, and the door, and the child, and the light on the wall, and the small, unremarkable smoke of her own fire. "I have a house that draws," she said. The old woman smiled. The cat pressed against Sarah's knee. The light went on, turning gold. "Thank you for staying with Sarah through the damp and the hail and the long, slow warming of a house that everyone else had written off. If the quiet dignity of what she built has stayed with you the way it stays with me, do leave a kind word below. Share where you are listening from, and press the small bell so the next story finds you. Another lantern is already lit. Another door waits on its hinges, and there is a hearth on the next lane where we will meet again soon."